Welcome back to FuzeTox channel. In this video we will read another article, I believe simplified bulk, Ultimate React Router v version 6 White. Tag React. React Router is the most popular routing library in React, but it can be a bit complicated to wrap your head around some of the more complex features. That is why in this article I will be breaking down everything you need to know about React Router so you can use even the most advanced features with ease. This article will be broken down into 4 sections. First, React Router Basics, Advanced Route Definitions, Handle Navigation, Routers in Depth. As for me, I have a problem with React Router version 6, and I have a better experience with. I have a huge experience with React Router version 5, and 5 version is crazy different to the 6th version of React Router. So, React Router Basics. Before we start diving into the advanced features of React Router, I want to talk about the basics of React Router. In order to use React Router on the web, you need to run npm React Router DOM to install React Router. This library specifically installs the DOM version of React Router. If you are using React Native, you will need to install React Router Native instead. Other than this one small difference, the libraries work almost exactly the same. In this tutorial, I'll be focusing on React Router DOM, but as I said, both libraries are nearly identical. Once you have this library, there are things you need to do in order to use React Router. Set up your router, define your routes, handle navigation. So, configuring the router. The easiest step by far is setting up your router. All you need to do is import the specific router. You need browser router for the web and native router for mobile, and wrap your entire application in that router. Import React from React, import React DOM, import app from /app, import browser router from React router DOM, cast route, React DOM, create route. Route render. So we have browser router and app within. Generally, you import your router in the index.js page of your application and you wrap your app component. The router works just like a context in React and provides all the necessary information to your application so you can do routing and use all the custom hooks from React Router. Define your routes. The next step in React Router is to define your routes. This is generally done at the top level of your application, such as in the app component, but it can be done anywhere you want. So routes includes route, path, and element to home, past, books, element, book list. Defining routes is as simple as defining a route component for each route in your application and then putting all those route components in a single routes component. Whenever your URL changes, React Router will look at the routes defined in your routes component and it will render the content in the element prop of the route that has a path that matches the URL. In the above example, if our URL was books, then the book list component would be rendered. The nice thing about React Router is that when you navigate between pages, it will only refresh the content inside your routes component. All the rest of the content on your page will stay the same, which helps with performance and user experience. Handle navigation. The final step to React Router is handle navigation. Normally, in an application, you will navigate with anchor text, but React Router uses its own custom link component to handle navigation. The link component is a JavaScript wrapper around an anchor tag that helps ensure all the routing and conditional rendering is handled properly, so you can use it just like you would a normal anchor tag. So, we should import link tag. Then we have J6 is list element link to path, and then we have route to these elements, home with slash address URL, and book list with slash books URL. Now example, we added 2 links to the home page and books page. You will also notice that we used the to prop to set the URL instead of the href prop you are used to using with an anchor tag. This is the only difference between the link component and an anchor tag, and is something that you need to remember, as it is an easy mistake to accidentally use an href prop instead of the to prop. Another thing to note about our new code is that now we are rendering at the top of our page is outside of our roads component, which means when we change pages, this now section will not be rendered, as long as the content in the roads component will change when the URL changes. Advanced route definitions. This is where React Router really gets interesting. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with routing to make more complex routes easy to read and overall much more functional. This can be done through 5 main techniques. First, dynamic routing priority, nested routes, multiple routes, use routes hook. The most interesting is fifth technique, use routes hook. Dynamic routing. The simplest and most common advanced feature in React Router is handling dynamic routes. In our example, let's assume that we want to render out a component for individual books in our application. We could hardcore each of those routes, but if we have hundreds of books or the ability for users to create books, then it's impossible to hardcore all these routes. Instead, we need a dynamic route. Books with ID. The final route in the above example is a dynamic route that has a dynamic parameter of ID. Defining dynamic routes in React Router is as simple as putting a colon in front of whatever you want the dynamic part of your route to be. In our case, our dynamic route will match any URL that starts with /book and ends with some value. For example, books /book/first, /books book name, and /books/literary anything will all match our dynamic route. Pretty much always when you have a dynamic route like this, you want to access the dynamic value in your custom component, which is where the useParams hook comes in. So import useParams from React Router DOM, const ID equal useParams hook, return first book with ID. The useParams hook takes no parameters and will return an object with keys that match the dynamic parameters in your route. In our case, our dynamic parameter is ID, so the useParams hook will return an object that has a key of ID, and the value of that key will be the actual ID in our URL. For example, if our URL was book third, our page would render book 3. Routing priority. When we were just dealing with hard-coded routes, it was pretty easy to know which route will be rendered. But when dealing with dynamic routes, it can be a bit more complicated. Take these routes for example: books ID, books/new. If we have the URL books/new, which route would this match? Technically, we have two routes that match both books ID and books/new will match. Since the dynamic route, we just assume that new is the ID portion of the URL, so React Router needs another way to determine which route to render. Another version of React Router, whichever route was defined first, would be the one that is rendered. So in our case, the books ID route would be rendered, which is obviously not what we want. Luckily, version 6 of React Router changed this, so now React Router will use an algorithm to determine which route is most likely the one you want. In our case, we obviously want to render the books/new route, so React Router will select that route for us. The actual way this algorithm works is very similar to CSS specificity, since it will try to determine which route that matches our URL is the most specific, has the least amount of dynamic elements, and it will select that route. While we are on the topic of routing priority, I also want to talk about how to create a route that matches anything. Pass element not found. This symbol will match anything at all, which makes it perfect for things like 404 page A road that contains a star will also be less specific than anything else, so you will never accidentally match a star road when another road would have also matched. Nested roads. Finally, we have come to my favorite part of React Router, which is now they handle road nesting. In the above example, we have 3 roads that start with /books, so we can nest those roads inside of each other to clean up our roads. Road path, books, road, index element, book list, path equal id element book, and path new element new book. So how it works? The nesting is pretty simple to do. All you need to do is make a parent road that has a path prop set to the shared path for all your child road components. Okay, it's simple. /books for this. Then inside the parent road you can put all the child road components. The only difference is that the path prop of the child road components no longer includes the shared books road. Also, the row for books is replaced with a road component that has no path prop, but instead has an index prop. All this is saying is that the path of the index road is the same as the parent road. Now, if this is all you could do with nested roads, it would be only marginally useful, but the true power of nested roads comes in how it handles shared layouts. Let's imagine that we want to render an else section with links to each book as well as a new book from any of our book pages. To do this, normally we will need to make a shared component to store this navigation and then import that into every single book related component. This is a bit of a pain, so React Router created its own solution to solve this problem. If you pass an element prop to a parent road, it will render that component for every single child road, which means you can put a shared null or other shared components on every child page with ease. Road path /books element books layout, import link outlet, export function books layout, link books first, books second, books new, outlet. The way our new code will work is whenever we match a road inside the /book parent road, it will render the books layout component which contains our shared navigation. Then whichever child road is matched will be rendered wherever the outlet component is placed inside our layout component. The outlet component is essentially a placeholder component that will render whatever our current page content is. This structure is incredibly useful and makes sharing code between roads incredibly easy. Now the final way you can share layouts with React Router is by wrapping child road components in a parent road that only defines an element prop and no path prop. Road element other layout, road path contact element contact, road path about element about. This bit of code will create 2 roads, contact and about, which both are rendered inside the other layout component. This technique of wrapping multiple road components in a parent road component with no path prop is useful if you want those roads to share a single layout, even if they don't have a similar path. Outlet context. The final important thing to know about outlet components is they can take in a context prop, which will roll just like React context. Outlet context, hello, object word, hello property equal to word, import use params, use outlet context from React Router DOM, export function book, context, use outlet context, and return as first book id context.hello. As you can see from this example, we are passing down a context value of hello world, and then in our child component we are using the use outlet context hook to access the value of our context. This is a pretty common pattern to use since often you will have shared data between all your child components, which is the ideal use case for this context. Multiple roles. Another incredibly powerful thing you can do with React Router is use multiple roles components at the same time. This can be done as either to separate rows components or as nested rows. Separate rows. If you want to render two different sections of content that both depend on the URL of the application, then you need multiple rows components. This is very common if, for example, you have a sidebar, you want to render certain content for certain URLs and also a main page that should show specific content based on the URL. Import roads, link, home, book list, book site. Aside, roads, road path, books, element, book sidebar. In the above example, we have two rows. The main rows defines also main components for our page, and then we have a secondary rows inside the side that will render the sidebar for our books page when we are at /books. This means if our URL is /books, both of our rows components will render out content since they both have a unique match for /books in their rows. Another thing that you can do with multiple rows components is hardcode the location prop. Rows location /books. By hardcoding a location prop like this, we are overriding the default behavior of React router. So no matter what the URL of our page is, this rows component will match its row as if the URL was /book. Nested rows. The other way to use multiple rows components is to nest them inside one another. This is pretty common if you have lots of rows and want to clean up your code by moving similar rows into their own files. Row path /books/ anything element books rows. Nesting rows in React Router is pretty simple. All you need to do is create a new component to store the nested rows. This component should have a rows component, and inside the rows component should be all the row components that you are matching with the parent row. In our case, we are moving all your /books rows into this book row component. Then in the parent rows, you need to define a row that has a path equal to the path all your nested rows share. In our case, that would be /books. The important thing though is you need to end your parent row path with anything symbol, otherwise it will not properly match the child rows. Essentially, the code we have written says that whenever a row starts with /book/ it should search inside the book rows component to see if there is a row that matches. This is also why we have another anything symbol row in book rows, so that we can ensure if our URL does not match any of the book rows to properly render the not found component. Use rows hook. The final thing you need to know about defining rows in React Router is that you can use a JavaScript object to define your rows instead of JS6 if you prefer. Import rows, export function, row, nested rows, then row, export function up, path root, element home, path books, children, index true, element book list, path ID, return element. These two components both have the exact same rows, the only difference is how they were defined. If you decide you want to use rows hook, all the props that you would normally pass to your row components are instead just passed as key value pairs of an object. Handle navigation. Now that we know how to define our rows, we need to talk about how to navigate between those rows. This section will be broken down into three sections: link navigation, manual navigation, navigation data. First, link navigation. First, I want to talk about link navigation since it is the simplest and most common form of navigation you will encounter. We have already seen the most basic form of link navigation using the link component. A link to root, a link to root home, link to /books, books. These link components can get a bit more complex, so for example you can have absolute links like the bow links, or you can have links that are relative to the current component being rendered. Link link to root home, link to dot slash back, and link to edit should edit. For example, imagine we are in the book /3 road with about links. The first link will lead to the root road since it is an absolute road. Any road that starts with a slash is an absolute road. The second link will lead to the road /books since it is a relative link that goes up on one level from /books /3 to /books. Finally, our third link will go to the books /3 edit page since it will add path in the to prop to the end of the current link since it is a relative link. Besides the to prop, there are also three other props that are important to the link component. Replace. The replace prop is a boolean that when set to true will cause this link to replace the current page in the browser history. Imagine you have the following browser history /books /box /3. If you click on a link that goes to the book /books /3 edit page but it has the replace property set to true, your new history will look like this /books /3 edit. The page you are currently on was replaced with a new page. This means that if you click the back button on the new page, it will bring you back to the books page instead of the books /3 page. Reward document. This prop is another boolean and is very simple. If it's set to true, your link component will act like a normal anchor tag and do a full page refresh on navigation instead of just rendering the content inside your roads component. State. The final prop is called state. This prop lets you pass data along with your link that doesn't show up anywhere in the URL. This is something we will cover in more depth when we talk about navigation data, so we can ignore it for now. Now link. The next element I want to talk about is the now link component. This component works exactly the same as the link component, but it is specifically for showing active states on links. For example, in now bars by default, if the to property of a nav link is the same as the URL on the current page, the link will have an active class added to it which you can use for styling. If this is not enough, you can instead pass a function with an isActive parameter to the class name or style props, or as the children of the nav link. Style is active, arrow function color is active, red, black. The nav link also has one prop called end, which is used to help with nested routing. For example, if we are on the /book /3 page, that means we are rendering the book component which is nested inside our books row. This means that if we have a nav link with a to prop set to /books, it will be considered active. This is because the nav link is considered active if the URL matches the to prop of the nav link, or if the current row being rendered is inside a parent component that has a path that matches the to prop of the nav link. If you do not want this default behavior, you can set the end prop to true, which will make it so the URL of the page must exactly match the to prop of the nav link. Manual navigation. Now sometimes you want to manually navigate a user based on things like submitting a form or not having access to a specific page. For those use cases, you will need to either use the navigate component or the use navigation hook. Navigate component. The navigate component is a really simple component that when rendered will automatically redirect the user to the to prop of the navigate component. Navigate to root. The navigate component shares all the props of the link component, so you can pass it the to replace and state props. This component is not really something I use much, as more often than not I want to redirect the user based on some form of interaction like a form submission. Use navigation hook. The use navigation hook, on the other hand, is a hook I use all the time. This hook is a really simple hook that takes no parameters and returns a single navigate function, which you can use to redirect a user to a specific page. This navigate function takes two parameters. The first parameter is the location you want to redirect the user, and the second parameter is an object that can have keys for replacing state. Const navigate, use navigate function on submit, navigates /books, replace true, state, book name, fake title. The bulk code will redirect the user to the /books route. It will also replace the current route in history and pass along some state information as well. Another way you can use the navigate function is to pass it a number. This will allow you to simulate hitting the forward back button. Navigate -1, go back 1 page in history. Navigate -3, go back 3 pages in history. Navigate 1, go forward 1 page in history. Navigation data. Finally, it is time to talk about passing data between pages. There are three main ways you can pass data between pages: dynamic parameters, search parameters, state location data. Dynamic parameters. We have already talked about how to use dynamic parameters in URLs by using the use params. Look, this is the best way to handle passing information like IDs. Search parameters are all of the parameters that come after a query string in a URL. Query string name equal Kyle and age equal to 27. In order to work with search parameters, you need to use the use search params hook, which works very similarly to use state hook. Import use search params from React Router DOM, export function search example, return const search params, set search params, use search params, and equals 3, const number search params dot get, return hash first, input type equal number, value equal number, on change equal event, arrow function, set search params, and a target dot value. In this example, we have an input that as the type and will update the search portion of our URL. For example, if our input as the value of 32, our URL will look like http / localhost 3000 query string and equal to 32. The use search params hook takes an initial value just like useDate, and in our case our initial value has n set to 3. This hook then returns two values. The first value as all our search parameters, and the second value is a function for updating our search parameters. The set function just takes a single argument that is the new value of your search parameters. The first value that contains the search parameters is a bit more confusing, though. This is because this value is of the type URL search params. That is why we need to use .get syntax on line 5 above. State location data. As the final type of data you can store is state and location data. This information is all accessible via the use location hook. Using this hook is very simple, as it returns one value and takes no parameters. Const location equal use location hook. We have the following URL: http / localhost books query string and equals 32 ID tag ID. Then the return value of this location will look like this: path name /books search query n equal 32 hash ID key state null. This location object contains all the information related to our URL. It also contains a unique key that you can use to do caching. If you want cache information for when a user clicks the back button to come back to a page. You also will notice that we have a state property being returned from use location as well. This state data can be anything and is passed between pages without being stored in the URL. For example, if you click on a link that looks like this, link to /book state object, then the state value in the location object will be set to name Kyle. This can be really useful if, for example, you want to send across simple messages between pages that shouldn't be stored in the URL. A good example of this would be something like a success message and it gets sent to the page you are redirected to after creating a new book. Routers in depth. Now that covers 95% of what you need to know about React Router, but the library has a bit more depth still. In the first section of the basics, we talked about defining your router, and we mentioned the browser router and native router, but those are not the only routes. There are actually 6 routes in total, and in this section I will be explaining each of them in depth. Browser router. To start, I will cover the browser router since it is one we are already familiar with. This is the default router you should use if you are working on a web app, and is the router you will use in 90% of all your applications since it covers all the normally routing use case you have. Each of the other routes I will talk about have every specific use case where you will want to use them, so if you don't fit those use cases, then the browser router is what you should use. Native router. The native router is essentially the equivalent of the browser router, but for React Native. If you are using React Native, then this is the router you want to use. Hash router. This router works very similar to the browser router, but the main difference is that instead of changing the URL to something like http localhost 3000 books, it will store the URL in the hash like so. http localhost 3000 /hash/books. As you can see, the URL has a hash after the URL, which represents the hash portion of the URL. Anything in the hash portion of the URL is just additional information that it usually denotes an ID on the page for scrolling purposes, since the page will automatically scroll to the element with the ID represented by the hash when the page loads. In React Router, this hash is not actually used to store ID information for scrolling, but instead it stores information related to the current URL. The reason React Router does this is because some hosting providers do not allow you to actually change the URL of your page. In those very rare circumstances, you will want to use the hash router, since the hash router will not change the actual URL of your page and will only change the hash of your page. You are able to use any URL with your hosting providers, and this is not something you should use. History router. The history router, currently called unstable history router, is a router that allows you to manually control the history object that React Router uses to store all the information related to the history of your application's routing. This history object helps make sure things like the backend form of button and the browsers work properly. This is a router you should probably never use unless you have a very specific reason that you want to override or control the default history behavior of React Router. Memory router. The memory router is a bit different than the rest of the routes we talked about, since instead of storing information about the current route in the URL of the browser, this router stores information routing directly in memory. Obviously, this is a very bad router to use for normal routing operations. But this router is incredibly useful when you are writing tests for your application that do not have access to the browser. Because of how React Router works, you need to have your components wrapped in our router, otherwise all your routing code will throw errors and break. This means even if you want to test a single component, you will need to wrap that component inside of a router, or it will throw errors. If you are testing your code in a way that doesn't have access to the browser, such as unit testing, then the routers we have talked about so far will throw errors, since they all depend on the browsers for the URL. The memory router, on the other hand, stores all its information in memory, which means it never accesses the browser and is ideal when trying to unit test components. Other than this specific use case, though, this router is never to be used. Static router. The final router is a static router, and this router again has a very specific use case. This router is specifically meant for server rendering your React applications, since it takes in a single location probe and renders out your application using that location probe as a URL. This router cannot actually do any routing and will just render a single static page, but that is perfect for server rendering, since you just renders the HTML of your application on the server, and then the client can set up all your routing and so on. Static router, location, /books, app, component. Conclusion. React Router is a massive library with tons of amazing features, which is the reason it is the go-to routing library for most people. I really love how they handle things like nesting, since it makes creating intuitive and clean routes so much easier. So as for me, I have an experience in using React Router version 6, and it's a very bad experience. So now with this article I have a hope to make things clear with this version of React Router DOM. So the 5th version of React Router DOM is more easy to understand as for me, and I have a big project with React Router DOM version 5th, and as for me it was difficult to migrate from 5th version to the 6th version. They makes a lot of changes in the routing logic in the React Router DOM library, and it's hard to use it. They add hooks, use navigate, and they move some features from the React Router 5th. So thanks for watching. Bye.